And I'll just give you a bit about background about my, I suppose, journey in high streets. I started taking an interest in the changing face of high streets many years ago as a journalist. I then moved on into sort of a policy capacity, working with a former cabinet minister, and took much more of a deeper interest in how to support businesses and communities in the changing face of high streets. That then developed into me working with the former retailer, Bill Grimsey, and I worked with Bill on 3 consecutive major high street reviews. Was really pleased to see Bill present before Parliament last week at the Select Committee on their current inquiry into high streets. And more recently, I've been working as a consultant, helping local authorities around the country, not just on things like consultations. I'm working a lot on the government's Towns Fund and on the Future High Streets Fund, but also in developing longer term plans, solutions, and helping them adapt to the challenges of the 21st century. So over the last year, I've seen an awful amount of change across the country, and I've seen how local authorities and BIDs and other actors have responded, and in some cases not responded to that change. But one thing I want to make clear, that change is really gathering pace now. COVID-19 has been extremely disruptive. What we're quite probably seeing is over a decade's worth of change being kind of condensed or happening very quickly in 6 to 12 months. So it is a kind of remarkable, dizzying time at the moment. I don't want to spend all this time talking at you, so I'm going to try and rattle through a presentation as quickly as possible, which is really about the kind of change we're seeing on our high streets. And then, you know, I'm hopeful we can have a quick discussion on that afterwards. Before I jump into that, if I could just make a few sort of observations on Fleet, because some of you may know I was down in Fleet myself last month, and had a really good time, really enjoyed my stay there. I know that Fleet has been named the best place to live in the UK on a few occasions. It's won that accolade on more than once, and that is obviously a great start for any high street. It really does sort of lay the foundations. But what I found was a really welcoming, inviting, and safe place, and I was really pleased to meet some great businesses who are working extremely hard. I think what I found genuinely inspiring was that a number of the businesses I spoke to had started during lockdown, you know, which is probably the you know, during the pandemic is probably the worst time ever to set up a business or to just launch a business on a high street. And they were genuinely positive and bullish and, you know, quite optimistic about their future prospects and looking forward to 2021. So I found that really inspiring and did really take heart from that. There are some areas I would potentially advise where Fleet could be improved, the high street. I certainly think it could have better public realm. There could be more gathering spaces, gathering points, more green spaces, you know, and a real kind of heart on the high street. You know, I'm not sure there's a very obvious anchor there at the moment, but that's certainly, you know, a discussion point, and we can take questions and possibly discuss that at the end. So if I can move on to the first slide, Tracy. So I'm going to start with all the bad stuff. Let's try and clear that out of the way to begin with, because as I said, I'd like to make this as positive as possible. There are massive challenges facing the high street at the moment, but these challenges haven't just dawned upon us this year. They've been coming down the track for some time. The British Retail Consortium said that 2019 was the worst year on record for retail sales, and obviously 2020 is certainly not going to be an improvement. Retail experts at KPMG expect high street retail space to shrink by 25% by 2022-2023. I actually think it's going to shrink by more than that. There was a report last week that said we currently have a 40% oversupply of retail space, and I do think there is too much retail space in the UK. We are starting to see that shrink and really come back, and the real challenge, as I'll get onto in a minute, is about repurposing. It's not as bad here in the UK as in the US. I mean, the average retail space is around, you know, 5 square foot per person here in the UK, where it's 23 in the US. So you've seen a massive kind of change at the moment, and it's really interesting looking at how they're repurposing retail space. More than 125,500 retail jobs have been lost so far this year. So, you know, this is, you know, a big challenge. You know, I will say that I'm very interested in a kind of a post-retail landscape in terms of for a long time now, retail has been the sole mainstay of high streets. Retail will always be with us. There's always going to be a place for good retail, but it's going to have to be complemented by a lot more stuff as well as we move forward. So if I could have the next slide. How will COVID-19 accelerate change? Well, it certainly is doing that, and it's a phenomenal and dizzying rate. I mean, there's just a few headlines. Online shopping makes many high street jobs unviable, says Lord Wolfson, the next boss. 3/4 of the UK does grocery shopping online. I mean, I think one of the key things which we've seen throughout lockdown is that many sort of late adopters to e-commerce, have found that, you know, they've been able to move into online shopping very easily, and those digital habits will certainly harden in the future. I know when I talk to Bill about this, he says his grandchildren laugh at him and say, seriously, Grandad, do you honestly go shopping for a toilet roll? The generation coming forward now is just not going to spend time going out and parking and going for all the rigmarole just to buy kind of, you know, a lot of kind of mundane everyday goods. Online shopping, drones, Amazon, it's here to stay. And the last headline, I think there's quite a good line from that somewhere, if I can find it. I'm struggling to find it, but I think there's a line from that article which said something along the lines of, you know, we used to travel around the ring roads looking for shops. Now we just follow links on a computer screen, something like that. But certainly they are all indications of how the future is changing. I mean, the change that's been accelerated is not all for the bad. I mean, there are some people, it's worth noting here, who've done pretty well out of the pandemic, most notably the supermarkets. Not least because they got quite a big business rates windfall as well. I think £2 billion around and all. But working from home is another, you know, big change that's not on that screen in terms of a headline. But that is certainly changing the face of town centres and high streets. And, you know, whilst we are going to see a lot of people going back to work in the new year and as we come out of lockdown, I think some of those that change will remain, and a lot of people still work from home. We've also seen home improvements do really well, technology to support working from home. And I think an interesting fact is more people are now cooking from scratch as well. So there's lots of really interesting changes. I can move on to the next screen. So I've alluded to the fact that retail's shrinking, that there's an oversupply of retail. And I think the mantra for next year is going to be repurposing, repurposing, repurposing. You know, a recent survey of more than 400 property development bosses found that 38% of executives had already switched retail properties to other uses, and a further 57% were considering doing the same. You know, my worry is that if we come out of Christmas, obviously this is the golden quarter for businesses, and you know, town centres are really hit very hard, and there's a lot of empty shops in the new year. I worry that councils will move, you know, to perhaps switch quite quickly to housing and not actually take a much more kind of creative approach to this, because housing is just one part of the jigsaw, and I don't want to see really bad housing all over high streets. Certainly good housing, you know, is needed, but you know, for me this is about firing the starting gun on a race for sort of innovation, and we have to build imaginative and creative spaces. You know, we're seeing retail space being repurposed for housing, leisure, co-working spaces, food halls, education, maker spaces, culture. The picture on the right, some of you will know, is Lock 29 in Banbury, which is a really interesting food and drinks destination. And that used to be an old BHS building. I think what I found interesting in Fleet as well is, as we're seeing high streets start to diversify and move away from traditional retail uses, some of the things which have already been flagged up, I suppose, by the National Commentariat, you can see, you know, real proof of, living examples in Fleet on the high street. And by that, I mean yoga, cycling shops, gaming. I mean, there's one business I met who I think its target demographic was something like 8 to 16-year-olds, which was really interesting. So if we could have the next slide, please. And so another interesting change is we are going to see more community involvement. There's two examples on the screen here. One is a community-owned market space in Radcliffe, which is a place in Greater Manchester. It's a pretty run-down area, I have to be honest. It's probably best known for being the birthplace of Danny Boyle. And one of the chaps at the bottom screen there is a councillor, and he helped develop a community-owned market and food hall, and it really is a fantastic community space. They have sort of entertainment, artisan food, community meetings. There's an art space underneath. It's a really amazing community asset, and has really had a positive net contribution in terms of developing community spirit, social capital, really boosting the local area. Tracy, oh, that's okay, yeah. That example, by the way, is in a report by an organization called Power to Change, which is all about community ownership on the high streets. And I think one of the things I've noticed, which is quite worrying, a worrying trend as I've gone around the country, is there are a lot of places where, shopping centres, arcades, big retail places are owned by overseas investors that don't have much commitment or interest in the town, and they're not properly invested in it. They're not accountable to the local community. So the more community-owned business is in town centres of the future, I think the better, and there should be a move to encourage that. And I'm really interested to see that there's been a number of kind of government reports recently, which is starting to kind of push that movement. On the right is an example in Belgium, and this is in a place called Roeselare. It's in Flanders. And I went there last year with the District Council's network and Bill Grimsey. And we went there because the mayor of Roeselare is a chap called Chris de Klerk, and he adopted a lot of the recommendations of the Grimsey Review. And what he did here was he basically completely transformed a car park. That space there was a car park, turned it into a green space. He opened a market next to it, which I'll show you in a minute. And it's made a great community space in which every Thursday, I think it's Friday nights, you see literally hundreds of people eating finger food, gathering, socializing, having a great time. I will just say about Chris de Klerk as well. He has powers as a mayor that we don't have here. So one of the biggest challenges I know in the UK is landlords and perhaps a rental corrections that is needed. And many people are priced out of the market. Chris can fine landlords if they keep units empty for too long. And he told us when he became mayor, he had to track down a lot of buildings. Some were owned by operators in Japan, the Cayman Islands, wherever, all around the world. It's pretty similar here in the UK. And at first they ignored him. Then 6 months later, he sent them a €100,000 fine, and they got in touch with him very quickly. And within a few months, rents were halved, and they have a lot of independence there now. It really has transformed the sector. So it's quite interesting. We will see that price correction in the UK in time, but it may take longer. And you were already seeing turnover lease arrangements and very different things coming onto the market, which is interesting. The next slide, please. I will just echo what Tracy said at the beginning, actually, which I forgot to emphasize. If you have any thoughts, please do share them on the chat box, as I'd like to get through those at the end. Not necessarily just questions, but any observations, any hopes, any fears that you have about your high streets, please do share them. So this is the market adjacent to the car park in Roeselare, and this was a former church. And all these slides, I'm trying to show you how change is manifesting itself on high streets, not just here, but across Europe in this case, and, to demonstrate best practice. The mayor deconsecrated this building. It was an empty church, introduced a market there, which they really carefully curated with a lot of local producers. And they've worked really hard, I suppose, to kickstart a very good local food economy, which is really interesting. And, some of that does go on in the UK, but not nearly enough. Next slide, please. So another example of how change is going to sort of manifest itself is through, the need for more vibrant social space. Interestingly enough, the last global pandemic, the Spanish flu, the 1920s saw a real explosion of leisure, and I think 100 years later we may see the same. I certainly was intrigued to see a report the other week, I think it was by Servation, that a lot of towns, when asked, people said they wanted more gathering points, more communal spaces, more social spaces, which is very much reflects a move towards that kind of community hub model which we're seeing. This is Bradford City Park in Bradford, which is an amazing flexible space. You see some great events there, people gathering, has the largest fountain in the UK, and that's lit up every night. And it really is a kind of powerful social space. And this is, I guess, a reflection of the direction of travel that high streets are moving in, and they're no longer just going to be temples of commerce. Obviously, we have a massive shift now towards e-commerce and towards online shopping. And as I said before, those digital habits are going to harden. So people need different reasons to come into their high streets. And, one thing which we cannot escape from is there's a real human need to socialize, to gather, to spend time. And I always argue when I'm talking to local authorities that high streets are not about kind of quick transactions. They're not about nipping in and out. The best high streets are those where you really do spend some time and enjoy that time and socialize and meet people. And I often ask people, what measurements or what data do you have on dwell time? And some of the best high streets are those which have a really clear understanding of how long people spend their time, how long people stay there, and what they do. So if I can move on to the
I was just going to jump in there, Matt, actually, because there's a question about what are maker spaces, if you could expand on that a bit more.
Okay, so maker spaces or fab labs, often they're in libraries. Actually, they're basically places where people come together and collaborate, usually on technical stuff. So there's often kind of things like 3D printers. They're kind of sort of manufacturing spaces, really, where people make things. I used to do some work in Bristol, and there was some amazing work going on in maker spaces there, where basically kids were coming together and designing things which eventually got patented by Dyson. They're really just creative spaces. There's a lot of them around the UK. And as I say, many of them are housed in libraries as well. And, the modern library is changing as well. I do incidentally see libraries as kind of key anchors on high streets. So libraries traditionally used to be kind of a gateway in which, you went to find knowledge, you went to find books, but now knowledge is often technology. So people are going to libraries and maker spaces to look to, to use, 3D printers and to make things like that. So really interesting spaces, and look at fab labs as well. There's lots of stuff on the internet about them. So, okay. So what are we beginning to see? Well, we have to move out of a 20th century mindset, and the 20th century mindset has always been about just retail, temple of commerce, and that is a 20th century kind of street, really, where people go to shop, to buy things, and many of those people will now be buying stuff online instead. The high streets of the future are not going to be based on this kind of 20th century model where you have like an M&S or a Debenhams as an anchor tenant. That those days are gone. And I know there are still people, I still meet people today in local authorities who have those kind of almost like 2003 boom goggles on, and they still dream of big box retail developments. But a lot of that is going, and we have to look beyond that in kind of a post-retail landscape. So if we're going to see less of that, what are we going to see? Now, if you move on to the next slide. Now, these are quite quirky examples, but I want to give kind of, a flavor of the sort of playful, experiential things that are starting to take root on high streets. On the left is was a giant foam slide that was set up a few years ago in Bristol. I was there when that happened, and there was hundreds of people whizzing down a high street. I think it was on East Street, quite a hilly street in Bristol. Really, really fun, and a real great sense of kind of playfulness. And Bristol's quite good at that, and on the right is a lot of people doing yoga in the street. And I think what's interesting is you're seeing some businesses actually. I mean, Lululemon, some of you will know, they do this. They often have yoga classes before the day starts. So there'll be one at 8:30 or whatever. And you're seeing businesses starting to move into that kind of experiential realm. And ultimately, all of this is about feeding the experience economy, which I'll explain in a minute, is really starting to grow. And I expect it to come out as we come out of the pandemic. I expect that will really surge. I mean, I've been intrigued looking at sort of business propositions like, David Lloyd is setting up adrenaline parks and stuff like that. All this is going to happen next year. And there's some really fantastic things in the offing. So if you can move to the next slide. So we're also going to see things like this. I mean, on the left is kind of a pop-up kind of beer garden. I mean, this is a really interesting phenomenon in the States. That one is in Philadelphia. And they often sort of take root and appear in kind of empty lots or derelict spaces. Really great way of starting to regenerate places and to bring people and breathe confidence back into the place again. And they're really safe and well run, and brilliant examples of kind of that flexible space which I've been referring to. space being used for kind of multiple purposes. On the right is a food market, a food hall, and it's in a place called Altrincham, which is actually quite near to me. And this is quite a celebrated model, actually, in regeneration circles. Altrincham used to have the highest number of empty shops in the country. And the chap called Nick Johnson from Urban Splash invested quite a bit of his own money in this, really, and wanted to set up a food hall in Altrincham. And it really breathed a lot of confidence back into the town. And as a consequence, there's, you know, a lot of sort of restaurants and eateries and other food places which have opened up, you know, in the surrounding area. And it's really, you know, helped kickstart the local economy. I say the best thing about this, and I think what's key to high streets is that they serve all communities. Far too many high streets have a really narrow demographic. So you go there and you can see immediately that only a small section of the community is using it. If you go into the food hall in Altrincham at dinner time, you will see school kids eating pizza. You will see office work. You will see labourers in high-vis jackets, you know, having a drink or having a pie, and you'll see office workers there as well. I mean, it's a real mix of the community, and it's great that so many people all come together. So if we could have the next slide. These changes are not just coming about because of technological disruption. I mean, we all know that online shopping is really changing people's relationship to the high street, but there's something else more deeper and complex than that. And that's that a new generation's values are also driving change. I think that's really fascinating because in the next decade, we're going to see a massive wealth transfer across the world as baby boomers transfer their wealth to millennials. So you're going to see a younger generation with real massive spending power soon, and that's going to accelerate change even further. What do we know about millennials and Gen Zs? That, you know, this recent survey showed that 70% of millennials would rather spend their money on an experience or an event rather than buying things. And 62% of millennials plan to increase the amount of money they spend on experiences instead of possessions. And, you know, where I am in Manchester, we've seen actually more bars and restaurants opening than in London in recent years, which is absolutely phenomenal. And I think the experience economy is really taking root. And, you know, before the pandemic, you could see that very clearly. If, you know, if you went into Manchester on a Sunday night, there'd be a concert at the arena where there'd be 15, 20,000 people on a Sunday night. The experience economy is going to be really strong. I know obviously it's in dire straits at the moment because of lockdown, but I expect it to come back really strongly. You know, there are people like the chief exec of IKEA have talked about us reaching peak stuff. I don't think we're there yet, but I think high streets are going to be very much more based around experiences in the future. We can have the next slide. How can councils adapt to the experience economy? Well, I do talk about councils as the custodians of place. And I think councils have really taken on the mantle in recent years of starting to kind of shape their high streets. And I think it's become known to them that this is a really important hot button issue to the local community. People do care about their high streets. They're a real visible manifestation of community confidence and civic pride. And, you know, councils are recognizing this, and we're seeing a lot of them putting on events more so recently. And I certainly saw there's some quite good events being put on in Fleet, and that's, you know, credit to the council. Next slide. I'm going to be very brief on this slide, as I know pedestrianisation in Fleet is quite a contentious issue, but all I will say is that certainly we are seeing around the world, you know, high streets are changing. People are rethinking their environment. I'm, you know, fascinated by what's going on in Paris, for example, with Mayor Anne Hidalgo. You know, I spent quite a bit of time in Paris myself, and I was amazed that Parisians giving up their car. If anyone's driven around on Champs-Élysées or the Arc de Triomphe, they'll know why. You know, and there's some great things happening there. But all I will say is that high streets of the 20th century were designed pretty much exclusively around the car. High streets of the 21st century will not be designed exclusively around the car. They will be designed around the smartphone and around people. So those changes are coming whether we like it or not. Next slide. And it's also about building up local leadership capacity. I take a view that high streets need to see leaders, and I'm not really bothered where they come from. It could come from the bid, could come from the local authority, it could come from inspirational traders or key change makers. But the key thing is collaboration. It's about councils, bids, and other actors working together in a collaborative way. This chap here is a guy called Johnny Hayes, and he led Bishop Thorpe Road Traders Association in York. I'd suggest you look him up if you get a moment. It's known affectionately as Bishy Road in York, which has won the High Street of the Year, I think, a few years ago. Now, this is kind of quite a historic street in York, and it was doing pretty badly several years ago. Johnny runs a hardware store there, or he did, and he banded together with other traders and set a small kind of loose group together, and they started to try and set up events. They were very lucky to get the Tour de France to go through there. They got the council to close the road and had street parties. And very quickly overnight, they got thousands of people pouring into it and really turned it into a destination. And Johnny was really powerful in leading that. Earlier this year, I led before lockdown, I led the local government association's first leadership course on high streets for council leaders, and Johnny was one of the speakers there. He spoke incredibly passionately about how he'd worked together with other traders, and I think that sense of collaboration really is key. I mean, Johnny did a Christmas light scheme where he got local people to spend £5 on a light bulb. I think there was something like 5,000 people turned up because they all wanted to see their bulb on the street. So again, amazing, bringing in thousands of people to the street, and really turned it into a destination, and helped, I suppose, change that kind of dynamic. So really interesting. And you know, there are people like Johnny in every town. They just need encouragement. They need the councils to back them, and they need, you know, to collaborate more. So next slide. So I hope that's given you a quick flavour of some of the sort of change that we're starting to see manifesting, and the changes that are, you know, are dawning on high streets really, because high streets of the 20th century, we have to sort of forget that. And I think sometimes it can be very frustrating. I do a lot of consultations around the country, and when you start asking people, they all keep talking about this vision of yesteryear, about wanting the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. You know, high streets are not pickled in aspic. Those days are over. We need to start rethinking the high street as a new 21st century model. We are not going to swing back to the status quo. So, you know, what are kind of things that we might see a future high street as? Well, they will be social gathering points. They will be places that build community and strengthen local identity. They will be a workplace that meets modern needs. I know more people are working from home now, but they still need to go into towns, and they still need human company. And there's really great, fantastic, flexible workspaces, which I'm seeing springing up everywhere. Co-working spaces, brilliant. An experimental place where new jobs can be created. I've alluded to maker spaces, fab labs, lots of really interesting kind of collaborative spaces. In Bristol, there's some really great collaboration between kind of the university and the local authorities. I think the engine shed, really great example in there. There's lots of spin-offs and amazingly high value jobs being created. It'll be a healthy environment, an active space. You know, we do have to tackle pollution. It's criminal that basically people are dying from air pollution, and we do need to tackle that and have cleaner air and value that, and make spaces where you can walk, they're much more walkable, and people can really physically engage. You know, I love things like, you know, the midnight basketball spaces, which we've seen in London and New York and elsewhere. Brilliant. I'd like to see more of that. A space that's used by everyone, and all communities have a stake. You know, you need to ask yourself, does everyone want to come into our high street? Are there some communities that don't come in? And if they don't, why not? You know, it needs to be a place where everyone can gather. A place with a clear heart, with improved public realm. I've spoken a bit about that. A platform for localism, a driver for the local economy, and a unique destination. And if you get some of that right, then you'll have a fantastic place that's fit for the 21st century and will continue to thrive and do well. Thank you.